Following my recent shopping spree, today I'm looking at a plasma cutter with integrated compressor from the home of plasma cutters, which is obviously Lidl's. A tool review channel isn't a proper channel unless it's got a review of a Parkside plasma cutter, I don't think. And the one I'm looking at today is slightly different because it's got an integrated compressor. Now, plasma cutters work by forcing compressed air through a small pipe. In the centre of the pipe, there's a negatively charged electrode that is directly above the nozzle. The vortex ring causes the plasma to rotate quickly. If this applies a negative plasma condition, the reaction causes a current from the controlled plasma with a temperature of 16,614 degrees molten discharge. The plasma speed of 6.09. The working circuit allows the arc to occur. And the plasma remains in contact with the metal to be processed, the instructions tell me. So essentially, you create a spark, it gets really, really hot. You force compressed air through, then you've not only got that spark, you've got really hot air moving at about 6 meters a second, coming out the tip that will then be able to cut metal. So every plasma cutter needs a compressor to be able to push that hot air out that creates that plasma. Now, the last one I had, I needed a separate compressor to be able to do that. But this one has it integrated. So everything is in the box. So I don't need a separate compressor, which some of you may know if you watch my main channel, is now up in the loft. So if I want to do some cutting around my property, all I need to do is take out this box and the other supplied cables, and that's all I need, as well as a 240 volt supply. So having a look at this is really, really straightforward because there's only a few things to connect. At the bottom, you've got three outputs of the unit. One is the compressed air, another one is the electricity supply to the gun, and the third one is the earth to the piece of metal that you're actually cutting, whether that's a bar or a plate. The only other thing you've got on the front is a switch at the top here that has internal and external. You can actually use this with an external compressor, and all you do is you plug it in the back, so you don't need to use the internal compressor. Why you do that, I wouldn't know, because the whole point of having this unit is that you don't need a separate compressor, so you can if you want to. And the last thing is the power setting, and this is basically how many amps you're putting through the unit, and obviously the higher the amps, the stronger it's going to be, and if you're going to be cutting through thicker material, you're going to need to turn that up. Now, some will say that the higher the amps, the cleaner the cut as well, but we'll have a look at that when we get outside and start doing some cutting. Obviously, the rest of what you get in the set is everything you need to do your cutting. First of all, there's the earth-in clamp that you put onto the bar or whatever material you're cutting. And then lastly, you've got your main cutter here. It's got a couple of safety features, which means that this little tab here means you don't turn it on and off unless you really want to. And there's also a switch here that stops you pulling the trigger once again if you didn't want to. So there's sort of two safety things. We'll have a look at the cutter head in a minute. But essentially, through this tube, you've got the two connections which I just ran through on the front of the machine. One of them is the compressed air and the other one is the electrode to make that circuit. The front of the cutter unit is pretty similar to every other plasma cutter. It has a cutting head which you can actually, this is a consumable, so it does wear down, and that needs to be replaced every now and again when it does wear. Then you've got an internal sort of electrode. But with the unit, you do get another couple of spares there. So there's one already in, and there's another two that you get with the unit. And then just screws on nice and tight. So that's the dangerous bit where the plasma comes out, being pushed essentially by the compressed air. The last thing you get in the set is this little attachment here that actually clamps onto the front of the cutter once you've done these screws up. And it means that you can roll along material to get a nice straight cut. I've not tried that before, but that's something I'm keen to try. So putting all this together is very straightforward. And obviously the way they've set it up is that they've used plugs, which means that you just can't confuse one input for another. There you go. And then essentially that's it, you are set up. Connect this to the material you want to cut and then get going with this. I'll just show you quickly the back of the unit, and all you've got on the back is an on and off switch and the input for the external compressor, and that is all there is to it. However, one thing that I have just noticed taking it out the box, which I must admit I didn't notice when I bought the thing and it was sitting on the shelf, is although it's a 240 supply, on the other end of the cable is one of these. Obviously this is a bit of a concern because that looks like you really need to use it in a proper workshop that's rated as 16 amps. And doing a little bit of investigation on the internet, apparently this unit used to be supplied with a standard 13 amp 240 volt plug. Now, I think it was changed because quite often that tripped the system. But at the same time, Parkside advertised this as being able to be used at home. So what I'm going to do, which I would advise no one else to do this, is I'm going to change this for a 13 amp supply. I'm going to use it on a lower setting. I'm not going to wind it up too much and see what effects it has on my household supply. Obviously, I think the worst that can happen is the MCB just flips out. Don't try this at home, and let me change this, turn it on, and see if I have any success. So after reading the instructions, I've decided to set this up in the garden so there's nothing combustible around me. I plugged the unit straight into my external outlet, so I'm not using any extension cable between the house and the unit. So I've got no long cables wound up at all, which might help. I'm first going to try cutting some 5mm mild steel bar, which I've got left over from a previous project. And I'm starting with the amp setting really quite low at 15. It's the lowest setting I've got. Although the plasma cutter is actually cutting, it's not going all the way through. And if I linger too long and if I go too slowly, then you just end up with globules of molten steel. So it's pretty obvious after a couple of cuts that I need to turn the strength of it up to be able to actually get that plasma coming through, to be able to cut all the way through the 5mm steel. As soon as I turn it up, it has a definite improvement and you can feel that it's cutting better. And I think a bit like welding, this is what plasma cutting is all about. You've got various different variables, whether it be the speed that you're moving the head across the steel, or the power setting, and you've also got the thickness of steel as well. Actually, the art to it is being able to adjust those things so you get a nice clean cut. Okay, so that does need a little bit of dialing in. I've turned up the amps up to 30 now, so I started at 15, maximum is 40, it's up to 30, and it is a lot cleaner cut. And I must say, this unit is working a lot better than that old one I had, where I actually had to add a compressor. It just does everything itself. The only knob you've got is the number of amps, so it automatically supplies the right amount of air. And actually, that's not a bad clean cut. So I've sort of dialed it in now. So let's try something a little bit chunkier. So with the amp setting on 30 now, which is double what I've started, it's cutting a lot better, and at least it's getting through the material. Although just dragging it across the steel in a smooth, consistent speed, I must say, is more difficult than it looks. And once again, it's all about speed and the power setting you're on. And although some of these cuts I'm making feel pretty successful, once I've gone all the way round, the thing just doesn't want to fall off, because the sort of molten swarf that comes off the back has now has stuck to each side, and I don't really know which bit is now holding the whole thing up. Just like welding or bricklaying, this is all about practice, and the more of this you do, I'm sure the more successful you're going to get and the cleaner each cut is going to be. I then decide to move on and try it on some 2mm thick plate, so I'll make sure that I've got a good earthing for the clamp. And obviously, because the material is so thin, it cuts straight through it really quite easily. However, once again, just dragging it across the material is not as easy to get a consistent line as it looks. So I'd keep adjusting the power on it just to see what difference it makes. Then I decide to use the rollers that they supply in the kit. The rollers are just helping relieve some of that friction, just to make it glide across the surface a little bit easier. And I must say, immediately that does make a difference. It's not perfect, and that's probably my technique more than the kit. But to have those rollers in place really does make it a little bit easier, and it does make it easier to get a smooth, consistent cut. And after a little bit of playing around with this 2mm steel, I did get to a point where I'm sort of confident that I can cut all the way through fairly quickly without globules of molten steel sort of sticking the whole thing together. So that was very interesting. Just spent an hour in the garden cutting up whatever steel I could find. And the first thing I have to say is to have an integrated compressor with your plasma cutter is definitely the way to go. It just makes life a lot easier, not only because it's all in one unit, but actually you don't have to think about any of the pressure settings, and you're not worrying about whether the pressure is too low or too high. And the whole idea that you can just grab it and take it to wherever you want to work and it's all in one unit, I think is definitely the way to go. So if you've got a choice and you're looking for something like this, go for the integrated one for sure. You've only got one variable on the front, and that is your amp setting and how strong that cutter is. Now, I never really went up to maximum, so I'm pretty sure that it would trip something out in the house. The most I got to was about 35 out of 40. And I've got a feeling that if I'd done anything prolonged at that rate, something would have tripped maybe. However, that seemed to work anyway. If we look at some of the cuts that I've made, I don't know if you can see that on film, but actually that is quite a clean cut, except for the bit at the bottom, which sort of comes out the back side. Now I've found that if you go too slow, that swarf that's coming out the backside, that's essentially molten metal, tends to stick to each other and you don't get such a clean cut. So this is where the speed of the cut is quite important. If you're too slow, it tends not to cut all the way through. It tends to melt and then reapply itself. If you're too quick, it doesn't cut all the way through. So definitely there's an art to it, which I'm definitely haven't mastered yet. But you can see from this that actually the 5mm steel is quite well cut. It's just that I've got this stuff coming out the back. If we look at the steel plate, I've got the same sort of thing, that actually the 2mm steel, let me just get this a bit closer, the 2mm steel is cut quite nicely, but then you've got this sort of ragged swarf on the back, and it'd be quite easy to clean that up with a grinding disc once you've actually made the cut. So I'm pleased about that, and essentially between 2mm plate and 5mm steel, it worked absolutely fine. I think if you're looking at something thicker, like 10 or 12mm, like it says on the box, then this is going to have to be turned up to the maximum, which I'm not really prepared to do at the moment. I haven't got that sort of thickness still that I'm ready to cut anyway. So all in all, I think definitely a success. I'm glad I've got it. Definitely don't do what I did, which is change the plug to a standard 13-amp plug. Definitely get your own proper supply sorted out. So I definitely wouldn't advise you to start messing around with your electrics and changing the plug. But nothing tripped out on me, so it's something in the future that I'll see how far I can push it before things go awfully wrong. I hope you enjoyed this video and you've learned a little bit about the Parkside plasma cutter with integrated compressor. I will see you next time.